I just want to
Uh,
go
uh,
to Yehuda
yeah,
and Dr. Nick.
I think Matthew, I want to delve in. I kind of heard your question differently. I'm not sure if I got it wrong, but I think your question has some, you have to, make some assumptions which I don't know are true or not. So I think the first assumption you've made in it is that the first volunteers who signed up were the most motivated and had the highest morale, and therefore might have been more effective. And I'm not sure that's entirely true. And I think by inference you might have meant that people who have been conscripted or joined later might not have the gumption that the initial volunteers had. Again, I don't know if that's true either, but either way, let's assume it is. What is different is exactly what John just said, and that is there has been a year and a bit, almost a year and a half, where the Ukrainians have been able to fine tune and create training procedures, or they've been able to modify their battle schools to focus on missions that they may not have done initially. So, in other words, engineering is a big thing. Obviously, this is something that they've had to focus on just to demine oodles and oodles of terrain. Number one. Number two, you've got even the doctrine. No one's a doctrinist in the field or in a war, as John was saying. But you've got even just the organizational structure of your forces. You don't have anti-armor platoons anymore. You've got anti-armor companies. You've got layouts that just wouldn't have been thought of before, because that's not how we usually plan on it. And on top of that, you've got um, the battle schools that have a certain timeline of how long it takes to do stuff. So you have all these super smart people in Ukraine that are course correcting and saying, "Gosh, you know what? We need to do IT individual training for sure, 100%. We need them to be, we need to make sure they don't die in the cold as they're sleeping in a hooch or in a shell scrape somewhere. That's for sure. Okay, we got to do that now. We got to do this, and then we have to now these units here will be mechanized. There's no room for armor. Maybe they're not going to do combined arms in every sense of the word with every single unit, if they have different tasks. So there's a lot of rejigging that's occurred in the last year and a half. So I would argue that if you thought that the conscripts later or people who volunteered later might not have, the motivation morale. Remember, motivation morale don't just make you an effective soldier, right? You have to have the training. So I would argue that yes, while in general time might not be on their side, I think the increasing the length of training and the complexity and custom tailoring different training regimens for specific units that will do a certain thing, like assault brigades that will be doing break-ins and penetrations and exploitation. They obviously want to be the command staff there, the training commander there obviously wants to make sure certain units have certain skills that they might not have the time or luxury to give everyone. But in essence, I guess what I'm saying is, in that regard, the time would be on their side. Having feedback, right? Lessons learned, after action reports. Someone might have turned around and said, "Hey, listen, we sent our people to do this, this, and this in the UK and in Germany. However, what we needed was more of this, and therefore, if you're going to still train in the security assistance group Ukraine in Wiesbaden and in Germany and wherever else they're training, Czech Republic, we really want them to do a lot more of this. We want coordination or better combined arms training with engineers, because we are working with engineers like we never had, and therefore I think that the time that you have to have those lessons learned, to have them pushed back through the battle schools, and then getting the feedback from commanders and NCOs who have had that combat experience, that actually I think is worth is worth its weight in gold, I would argue. But yeah, I hope that helps, Matthew and John. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, John, go ahead. Then to Dr. Nick.
No, no, Yehuda covered it beautifully. I was actually just going to say that same thing with my, not this last trip, but trip before that, seeing the flyers up for the assault brigades. And like, was that just a recruitment flyer? No, no, that's a recruitment flyer for people that will join that very specific type of unit, with this very specific mission. And that was something that wasn't happening in the beginning, right? You enlisted because you wanted to fight, but where you would land wouldn't be as clear. Now, the challenge of, like Yehuda said, assault brigade's training pipeline was pretty set forward, and that's great. But then is every engineering unit standardized where no matter what unit it is, you know what their capabilities and training and everything they've received. And I think that goes back to what the Chuck said. Like, I didn't care what the look of a SEAL was that walked in. I know because that person is a member of that organization, the amount of training and autonomy and responsibility that one individual has received, and the self-policing of the organization. All of that comes with like items. I know that person's proficient character, competence, commitment, just because they're a member of that organization, and then I can plug them into the same role that I would any other person that walked in. That's the standardization that Ukraine can and I think is on the path, I hope, to doing. But I agree with everything Yehuda said for sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, there's that. Oh,
Go
I'm
ahead,
sorry,
Chuck.
Al. There's that, and in a perfect world, Ukraine is going to be able to rotate guys off the front, take those best practices and those best practitioners, and put them into this, that training loop that feeds itself back with, training to mission. Was the training to mission appropriate? And that measurement is, military success. But, we're chasing the magic kingdom a little bit. It's something that every armed force, including the United States, it's something to aspire to. And it's almost never going to be perfect. And, there's like no other profession on earth that is so life and death in every case. And, John knows this as well. I mean, you can't even describe combat to anybody. There's just no words to tell them what it's going to be like that first time, and almost every time, but that first time where it's so completely and absolutely overwhelming to every single human. You realize it's loud, it's crazy, the whole world is upside down, and it's life and death. And what you fall back on in those moments is you fall back to your training and those lessons that were really and literally written in blood, right? Those basic SOPs, something as simple as, right, you got contact, get down, right? Return fire, and not necessarily in that order.
I'm talking about. You take for granted that is part of the professionalization of even a private, is that automatic response without thinking, that when something happens, you hit the ground. That is not something that you get from a civilian. You have to invest the time, and there are repercussions when that is not standardized.
Yeah, and every skill, John, that we know that builds on top of that. You can be the most trained guy in the world. You freeze up at that moment of contact, and you catch some lead between your eyes, and it's over. And all of those things on top of that, it's not, it's shoot, move, communicate. You come into contact with the enemy, your world turns upside down in combat, and then, in John's case, in my case, and in Yehuda's case, and lots of other people who call up here, man, all of a sudden you're in charge, and you got to maneuver against the enemy, and you got to turn this situation around right now and bring the heat to them. And, we all know that's not as easy as it sounds, and it takes a lot to get a man or woman to that position. And frankly, it's complicated also because not every person is going to be able to do it. The SEALs spend, and John, you were talking about the organizational psychologists in the Army, and the Navy has put psychologists and psychiatrists and sociologists, and they try to find out what sort of person will make it through SEAL training, because they don't want so many people to quit. Right? Because like 2 in 10 people make it. So they figure we're going to find the guys that, are going to succeed so we can have more SEALs. But the truth is, nobody knows who's going to make it. Nobody knows. And it isn't the big, muscle-bound guy with the Speedo tan. Those guys don't last a week. Why is it that the 120-pound farm kid from Nebraska makes it and the California server dude doesn't? So that's the other magic in all of this, John, that is, I know it fascinates you and me as well. The improbable success of some people and the astounding failure of others.
Right. 100%. And actually, I didn't teach I taught at a school that people think teaches you tactics, right? Ranger school. It's just a microcosm, but I've always viewed that as giving an individual leader the responsibility to make a decision, and that's what that school is about. That's what training, especially for the leaders, right? Because everybody's doing their role. Like, if the soldier doesn't get down, he's dead. If this person doesn't make a decision, then there is, like in the Soviet system, there are reductions in performance. So that was one school where every individual leader is given a chance, like, you're responsible, it's your decision right now, and that's a reputation. And there's some people would freeze and not make a decision. Okay, you're not cut out for this. If you're in Ukraine's situation, they don't have that liberty, but there is value in giving people repetition on, you own the duty and responsibility to make a decision right now at this moment.
So I
And
just want,
that is, I'm sorry, Ranger School is one of the great leadership courses in the whole world, and those guys get run hard. Cold, wet, tired, miserable, hungry, and under pressure to make the best decision possible. And you go through that, and you show up to the battalion, folks, and you still have to take that other magical step. And it is the profession of arms. And I realized early in my evolution as a junior officer that I had a long way to go, right? That I was always going to be learning. And there was always, and it was always necessary for me to improve, because you realize that, people's lives are in your hands. And I took that, John, and I know you did too. I took that really seriously. I didn't want to write a letter home to anybody's mother saying, Mrs. Smith, I screwed up. I didn't want to do that. And that's what kept me awake at night. And it was never, I don't think, my own survival. That never bothered me as much as the responsibility of keeping my men alive and performing the mission.
No, 100%. And I actually had a psychologist review my book she pointed out, like, there seems to be a theme here. And it was me kept saying that my only fear, the only fear I ever experienced, and again, I'm not correlating my experiences to Ukraine, but my only fear ever was failure, as in failing the men that I knew I was responsible for, failing them as a leader. I never feared explosions, firefights. No, it just kept repeating. I didn't realize how many times I was repeating in every position I was in. That was my fear, was both an imposter syndrome of knowing that I didn't know the job, because that's almost baked into the system, and also the complete crippling fear of failure, of failing to do my job in this overall system, and that job, of course, is a responsibility for bringing people home.
I got a funny story about that, John. I was early in my career swimming up on a beach in Nicaragua in the moonlight, and I was crawling ashore, and I thought, shouldn't James Bond be doing this?
Nice. No,
Because
it's a
I
real
was
thing.
24 years old. I thought they should have sent somebody else.
well, maybe they shouldn't. Maybe they sent the right person, Chuck. Dr. Nick.
Well,
Okay, so a few things. One, Colonel Spencer had mentioned something about how one thing that he was noticing now is that they're recruiting for like specific like subunits, and he thought that was interesting. And I just thought I would mention that I've seen that too, like specifically with some of the battalions that I follow, the Chechen battalions, for example, the Dudayev battalion. They have the Atom Group, and that's a sabotage and reconnaissance, sort of like a specific subgroup, right? And they have been recruiting specifically, separately, from the Dudayev battalion. And the battalion named after Sheikh Mansour. I forget what this one is called, but it's a it's like an aerial battalion, but it's drones specifically. So it's like a drone operating unit, a variety of different types of drones that they operate, and they've been recruiting for that one as well. And so I just thought I would mention that because specifically the aerial one is more recent, and I thought that was kind of interesting. And then Colonel Spencer also mentioned the phrase, in relation to Ukraine specifically, that the one aspect of time not being on their side. And he said that, mentioned the phrase politics by other means, and that perceptions of performance is a problem. And this kind of, for me, really underscores the importance of uh, getting the story right, right? And why it's really important for different, and it's not just one outlet or two. There's multiple media outlets that are getting the framing and understanding of what's actually happening wrong, and that is a big problem, right? Because especially when we're talking about this war, I feel like they have a really huge responsibility to get that right, because they can shape that perception not only in the public, but policymakers say, who we know there are some of them who don't really want to support Ukraine. They can point to that reporting as sources to use against that funding, right? And so I think that, that's just another sort of point to kind of make. And then just moving along, Yehuda had mentioned something in relation to how a pilot needs to know multiple jobs in case they have to take over. I think he said something like a gunner position or something like that in the plane. And it kind of reminded me, and I guess kind of loops into also um, what Colonel Spencer had mentioned in relation to sort of basic soldiering, about like in the Marines, and I know it's the same in Navy, whatever, Army, Air Force, that it doesn't matter what your MOS is, right? You, like in the Marines, we called it knowledge. you know you sit there with that green book and you learn it and you're falling asleep, and you work on both your individual training, as and that with that green book, that knowledge book in the schoolhouse and all that stuff. And but that knowledge was so broad that it really didn't matter like what your MOS was. Like everybody still has to have those basic soldiering skills, so that no matter what, that you could become part of the infantry, at the squad level, um, and that would get practiced in the field, right? And uh, you had to be proficient with the M16A2, the M9 in my case, swim quals in my case, not necessarily in the Army, I don't think, field medicine, all that stuff, because you never know, right? Uh, you're operating, say, in the Fleet Marine Corps or whatever in peacetime, and that's the way it is until it's not, right? You're doing your specific job, even if it's the war, until suddenly you're not anymore. And suddenly, the back line is the front line. And suddenly you're having to pick up a gun and defend, a position. So I just thought I would throw that in there as well. And that's all I have.